Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start promptly because we're the last talk of the day in this room, and I want to make sure everyone gets out in time for drinks, especially if you're staying for the session after this upstairs for new entrants. So please stay around and join us. My name's Ruth Westcott. I work for Hussain as the campaign manager for the climate and nature emergency. Welcome to the policy room, which is co-hosted by us and the Soil Association. If this is your first session, thanks for coming. If not, I hope you've been having a great time at ORFC so far. So this session is going to follow the fairly standard panel session. Let's not shake it up because it's too late in the day. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then you're going to hear from our, frankly, ridiculous lineup of panelists, and then we'll go to questions from the floor. I'll ask a few questions, then we'll go to questions from the floor and questions from online. So there's no need to raise your hand as we're going. Keep your questions to yourself for now, and I'll come to you at the appropriate time. So this session is about how can we collectively coordinate a transition from intensive livestock that is just. And to set the scene, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are with factory farming at the moment. I think in this room, we don't need to spend too long thinking or talking about how damaging factory farming is, because I hope we're on the same page in understanding that it needs to stop. There's no place for factory farming in a food system which is just or fair. It's incompatible with the climate and nature emergency. It causes unacceptable greenhouse gas emissions and river and air pollution. As we've got Compassion in World Farming in the room, and their data shows that there's been an increase in the number of large intensive livestock units of 20% since 2016. So intensive livestock units are on the march. It's essentially all the work that we're doing to try and transition to agroecology is being undone by these large intensive livestock units, which are taking over the countryside in the UK. It's a social as well as an environmental crisis, and we must recognise that intensive livestock industry is a colonialist project as well. It involves controlling and exploiting people and land overseas to enable us to have cheap meat and generating profits for global agribusinesses. Yet, we still see it proffered as a solution to food security and for secure farmer incomes. And just today, we've seen Steve Reed announce that he plans to relax planning policy to enable more chicken farms to be either expanded or produced. So, on the basis of all that evidence that we've got about the expansion, there's a very good chance that that could get worse. So, I think this talk is more important than ever today, so I'm delighted to be hosting it. I think we also need to recognise that many farmers are in a bind. The reality is that intensive livestock units offer a secure income for farmers, which is very, very difficult to get, and increasingly difficult to get from other systems, especially in the context of climate change and Brexit, which means that incomes are becoming less and less secure. There's a growing movement of resistance against factory farming, and the reality is that the industry is now dividing rural communities and driving divisions in communities that already feel divided. And it's the industry narrative about food security and efficient use of land and the need for cheap food risks continuing to have a stronghold if we don't have a well-articulated alternative vision. So as policymakers, it's really important that we understand what injustices exist in the intensive livestock system now, and thus we can avoid replicating these injustices in any system that we suggest as an alternative. And this transition brings a number of questions, including what kind of food we want to produce in a new system, how we're going to ensure nutritional food security and sovereignty, and how we're going to include the right actors in creating a just and equitable transition. So that's enough from me. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my panel. We've got Dr. Lídia Cabral, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies and the lead investigator of a new project called Roots for Change, which is a new collaboration to explore rewilding as part of a just transition. We've got Jake Richardson, who is a researcher at the Royal Veterinary College and a union organiser. And we've got Stratford, who is the coordinator of the Greater Lincolnshire Food Partnership. So let's start with a round of applause for the panel. Okay. So you've each got roughly 5 to 7 minutes each, but I'm not going to be, cutting you off. So please, let's hear from you first, Lídia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this almost final session of the day, I guess. Let me just start by saying that I feel doubly an imposter here for, well, 2 reasons. I don't really work on livestock systems in the UK, and I don't also work much on policy in the UK. This is the policy room, so you might be a little bit disappointed. But Ruth and I, Sustain and IDS, the Institute of Development Studies where I work, have started this collaboration looking at engaging with the rewilding movement and pushing for a justice perspective on rewilding that combines nature recovery goals with food security, decent farming livelihoods and working conditions. So Ruth kindly invited me to join this discussion and say a little bit about our project that is just starting. So just to say a few things about myself. So I'm increasingly working in the UK context. I live in Brighton. I volunteer in an affordable food project. I've been studying grassroots innovations in food provisioning, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic. But most of my work and collaborations are far away. I'm Portuguese. I tend to work in Portuguese-speaking countries. A lot of my current research and collaborations are in Brazil. In the past, I worked in Mozambique, where I lived. And in those 2 countries, I had quite a lot of exposure with agriculture, agrarian issues, and policy, and the politics of policy in agriculture and in the food, in relation to food systems. So I bring also some insights on what food security, food sovereignty, and agroecology, specifically, hot topic with lots of interesting experience in Brazil, what those experiences are. So yeah, that's my position of speaking, I guess. Let me just also say that we have a food and development master's program at the Institute of Development Studies that I coordinate, and it's great that a lot of our former graduates are actually attending this conference and speaking at different sessions, so that's really great to see. So, but I'm here to talk about the Roots of Change project that Ruth has already mentioned. So the full title is Roots of Change, a Just Wilding Transition for the Agri-Food System, and we prepared a 1-pager, which I think will be available at some point today. There's a QR code for those of you who want to hear a little bit more. It's a project that is just starting, so the focus is on rewilding, but in the context of discussions around food security and justice in farming, and of course in the context of all the discussions around net zero policy in the country at the moment, and all the the debate around elms and so on. So it is a scoping study funded by the Agri-Food for Net Zero network, which some of you might have heard of. And we're really asking, what does rewilding and forms of agricultural wilding of various kinds may offer a balance between nature recovery, decent and fair farming livelihoods, and food security. So I wanted to say just a few words about rewilding, but just emphasizing that I'm not an expert on rewilding nor a rewilding advocate. We're here to engage critically with the experiences of rewilding and think about how, recognizing that there is momentum around this in the UK, what we understand to be some positive experiences. So I think in the spirit of engaging with that, this morning in the opening panel, I think the first speaker was talking about the need to preach or talk to the non-converters, not just talk about to those who are aligned with our thinking, but spread the word. So I think it's important to engage with other communities and see beyond the tensions that might exist. So rewilding is, in essence, about letting nature to recover in its own direction and with limited human intervention in ecosystems. So rather than try and manage and control plants, animals, and habitats, let's sit back and let nature take over and decide. And of course, there's a spectrum of interventions from those who propose no human intervention at all, which might be relevant to marginal lands where, that are not productive anyway, so letting nature take over, to other forms of rewilding where there are higher degrees of human intervention for managing that sort of a recovery. And these forms of, the idea of rewilding is very much aligned with very early ideas around nature-based farming and the words and vision of Japanese practitioner Masanobu Fukuoka, who some of you might have heard. And in his book, One Straw Revolution, I happen to have a copy here, published in the late 70s, he describes natural farming as putting doing nothing into practice, apologies. Putting doing nothing into practice as one thing farmers should try to accomplish. And let me just share his words directly with you. So it's putting doing nothing into practice is the one thing farmers should strive to accomplish. And he goes on and says the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. I think this is very much aligned with some of the words we heard this morning when we were talking about wisdom, solidarity, and so on. So as I was saying, there is a spectrum of rewilding approaches. Some of them might be more in line with Fukuoka's thinking. Some others are more sort of, aligned with perhaps stricter nature conservation ideas, the reintroduction of some species, links. There's a piece of news in the journal, in the newspaper today, about 2 lynx being released in the wild in Scotland without permission, and that created a lot of trouble. But so the reintroduction of species such as lynx, wolves, large herbivores, and pigs, to restore ecological functions. I'm from Portugal. I just spent a few days in the north of Portugal, where there's a rewilding movement emerging, and it is quite important in rural areas in Portugal, because there's been a huge exodus from the interior of the country, and as you might have heard, stories of wildfires every summer, getting quite a big issue. So rewilding can offer, reintroduction of large herbivores can offer a solution to address the wildfires problems in the context of abandonment of rural areas in Portugal. Of course, in the UK, the context is very different. So in the context of livestock, coming more to the theme of this panel, so rewilding may comprise naturalistic grazing, where grazing happens outside field-based sort of farming systems, more in the wild. And the arguments for rewilding are largely ecological. So it's about restoration of natural habitats, soil regeneration, increasing biodiversity, improvements in water quality, carbon sequestration, and so on. So no question that these are important goals to have. But there's a lot of concerns about rewilding, and these relate to social, economic, institutional issues. Concerns that rewilding might threaten ways of life, like the introduction of predators, loss of farming jobs, and livelihoods and identities. Land use conflicts, tensions around land access for different initiatives. And then, of course, concerns around food security and domestic self-sufficiency. This is something that farmers have been insisting on. Also, the costs of rewilding, the distribution of government funds in the context of ELMS. There was just a panel before talking about that in detail. The increasing price of land in the context of the controversial inheritance tax. So it is a very contentious, very fractious issue. But we should engage with it. We should try and walk the walk together, recognizing that the environmental goals are important and have to be embraced, but recognizing also the fact that these need to go hand in hand with social justice, and to say that a lot of nature recovery is important. But sorry, just trying to follow my thread of thought here. my point here was that the elms that we've been hearing about before say a lot about nature recovery, and there was a lot of debate around that in the previous session. But there's perhaps less concretely being said around connections being made between farming and sustainable farming practices and affordable and healthy food issues. So where I work more intensively on these days in Brazil, this discussion is usually goes hand in hand. Support to farmers to align with environmental goals, has equity considerations, so it is support to the farmers that need it the most, but also has considerations around food security and nutrition security and accessibility, affordability to healthy diets. So these are, government programs try to align the different agendas as much as possible. And this, I guess, something that I think the UK can learn from countries in the global south, such as Brazil, that's been integrating these different domains of policy. So more specifically, and coming to an end, Ruth, in case you're worried, just to say that more specifically, so I said that the project on Roots of Change is just starting, so this is an opportunity to introduce a project to you, to invite contributions. I'll come to that later. But just to say that, so we have a research component and a policy engagement component. Research will look at different experiences of interactions between nature recovery approaches, rewilding approaches, and farming, agroecological farming, regenerative farming, and so on, agroforestry, and so on. So we're interested in looking at the interfaces between these different approaches, the synergies, the connections, as well as the tensions, and learn from that. So connections, synergy, tensions between neighboring practices. And we've proposed to follow a landscape approach. We have identified within the south of England and in Sussex specifically a large initiative, Will to Waves, that some of you might have heard of. Within Will to Waves, we have the NEP wilding project, which is one of the best well-known initiatives in the country. We're not so interested in studying NEP because NEP has been, there's quite a lot of knowledge about that, quite a lot of written about it since Isabella Tree's book, Wilding, of course. But there's, within that broader landscape, there's a series of initiatives where rewilding, nature recovery practices, as well as agroecological practices within market gardens, for example, are being experienced. So we're interested in looking at that within that corridor. But we want, in this project, to do as much as possible building bridges between different communities and different debates. So we're using a social ecological justice framework. I'll come to that later to do that. But I think having in mind trying to bring together the rewilding community, the farming community, the food justice communities to find a common ground. So that we can find win-wins, experiences that tackle the various goals that we feel are important. So with that, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I can't wait for the social ecological justice framework. Jake, can I pass over to you now for your introduction? Thanks so much.
Cool. Yeah, thank you to Ruth and Lily for organising the panel and inviting me with two really cool speakers. I'm pretty nervous, so I'm just going to read from a sheet, but I hope it's not too unengaging. So yeah, I'm a first-year PhD student. I'm on the UK Food Systems Centre for Doctoral Training, which IDS is also a part of. But I'm based at the Royal Veterinary College in Camden. And my research will be looking at the political economy of the development of the broiler chicken industry in the UK since World War II, with a particular interest on the changing role of labour organisations in the governance of food in the UK. I'm just starting that project, so much of what I'm going to say today is based on the research of other academics and journalists and NGOs who I'll try to credit as I go through. And it makes up the rationale for investigating this history in more detail. So I don't have loads of answers yet, but yeah, I hope it's still informative. So as an introduction to the topic from my perspective, I'd like to briefly respond to the kind of question of what is the factory farm based on the development of the UK broiler industry. In doing so, I'll argue that the factory farm is a huge monopoly capital controlled system of production in which the farm itself is actually only one small component. And this will set me up to talk later about the workers employed in chicken processing companies, who are just as much food producers as any farmer are, as key agents of a just transition away from factory farming. So what is the factory farm? The first really important point to make is that the factory farm is an exercise in commodity production. It's organized primarily around the need to make profit and accumulate capital. This is not a new thing. The English agricultural landscape is one of the originating locations of capitalist production. So commodified fruit production is hundreds of years old. It doesn't start with the factory farm. The factory farm's not unique in that sense. So this leads us on to the second point, which is if the commodified nature of factory farming isn't what makes it unique, I would argue that instead the factory farm needs to be understood as a form of commodified food production that is uniquely adapted to the political economic context of countries like the UK and the US, but in the case of the poultry industry and my research, the UK in the 20th and the 21st centuries. And laying out these factors fully is probably outside the scope of even my entire PhD project, so I won't attempt to do it now, but I'll point to one key factor as an introductory point, which is the prevalence of cheap feed. So from the late 19th century, the global overproduction of grain, combined with a lack of protectionist policies in the UK, the repeal of the Corn Laws that always comes up in food policy discussions, made arable farming in the UK particularly financially precarious. And whilst this is often kind of lamented as the death of agriculture, it's not necessarily in that it's bad for arable farming, but if you're a livestock farmer who needs cheap feed, it's actually quite good. So the expansion of livestock farming as a strategy for adapting to this context was adopted in the UK and US quite enthusiastically. In the UK, this was predominantly in the form of beef and dairy production in the early 20th century. The intensive broiler production didn't really take off until after World War II. And a particular key point of that, which is demonstrative of the point I'm making now, is that intensive broiler production was very minor until 1953, when livestock feed was taken out of rationing controls. After 1953, when cheap feed suddenly becomes much more available, the production of poultry massively explodes. So in 1950, around 1 million chickens were consumed in the UK. By 1967, it was 200 million. It's an absurd explosion that is entirely dependent upon the prevalence of cheap feed. So in line with authors like Bill Winders, Dave Nibbert, and Mindy Schneider, I propose that the factory farm should be understood not as an effort to secure food security, but as a particularly profitable form of farming. And that doesn't necessarily mean lucrative, it just means more profitable than the other ones, in a context where grains that could be consumed by humans are overproduced and cheap. And as a final important point, poultry production in particular, though I think most factory farming forms, as a strategy for adapting to these contexts, did not develop primarily through the independent business decisions of lots of individual farmers. You can't farm hundreds of thousands of chickens in one shed without breeders to provide that many chickens, pharmaceuticals and feed to keep them alive, the slaughterhouse capacity, cold chain technology, and retail capacity required to sell that volume of meat. So it's a huge system of production, and as Andrew Godley and Bridget Williams' historical work shows, the early pioneers of the industry in the 1950s realized this quite quickly, that if they wanted to market chicken successfully as a cheap source of meat, it would require national coordination. And partly as a result of this, and partly just the tendencies of such a commodified form of production, the industry vertically integrated and concentrated extremely quickly, so that the early producers realized quite quickly that the most lucrative bits were the processing, the feed milling, all of that stuff. And the result of that in the present is that chicken production remains an industry that is coordinated by a small number of extremely powerful actors who make most of the profits. And the stats on the industry concentration aren't super clear, it's hard to find out, but two sisters, Moy Park and Avara, between them, who are the three biggest in the UK. Avara, a mix of Fazenda and Cargill, a merger between them. They claim to be slaughtering around 1 billion chickens per year between them. Obviously, that's from material they release. It might be less. But the total UK number is 1.1 billion, which suggests that these three companies might control over 90% of the production. So from that, the factory farm cannot be understood, neither structurally in the present or historically in terms of its development, as a collection of individual farm units. And this may be a controversial thing to say at a farming conference, the farm itself is arguably not even the most important part of that system. It's a small site in a massive system of coordinated capital accumulation. So in terms of then political strategy, moving towards a just transition, a just transition has to take on this entire system. It's not a question of one by one convincing individual farmers to make the business decision to switch away from agroecology, as much as supporting farmers to make those choices are important. I'll expand on strategy and kind of some of the following questions, but as a quick overarching principle, such a system can only be taken on by an organized alliance of agents from across the system, all of whom have an interest in and the power to halt such a system. So one of the key agents who fits that criteria are workers in the industry, for reasons that I'll explain later. And hence I'll be talking predominantly about them today. As a really important final note, I hope I'm not using too much time, I must say that I don't currently do field work with poultry workers. I've never worked those jobs myself. So today, in what I say, I don't intend to speak for them or tell you what they want or what their interests are. The point I'd like to stress today is more of a theoretical and a strategic one, and that is that poultry workers are a necessary agent in a just transition away from factory farming. And this is not just because in the kind of traditional worker-led just transition sense that in the event of a transition away from these forms of production that those workers' livelihoods will have to be protected, which is absolutely the case. But also because, as I think Ruth said out at the start, it doesn't look like that transition is happening. So it's not just a question of protecting their livelihoods. I would argue that because of their structural position, that there's no sight of a just transition away from these systems without the political agency and organized resistance from these workers. So it's not just a question of including them in a transition, it's more of a question of their political role and political agency in such a process. So yeah, that's all I'll say to start with.
My goodness, thank you so much. This is amazing, yeah. Wow, all right, Laura, over to you. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm Laura Stratford. I coordinate the Greater Lincolnshire Food Partnership. So you might know about food partnerships. There are like over 100 of us all over the UK. And we're all different and organised differently, but we're a CIC, we're independent. But the principle of food partnerships is basically the same, that we're place-based, so all our work is around the land and the communities of our place, and we're Greater Lincolnshire. We started as Lincoln Food Partnership, and it makes no sense to talk about a city without the land around it, so that's been our journey. But then we take a real system perspective on food. So all the big issues, I mean, food touches everything, right? But just to name some of the big issues: food security, climate and nature emergency, access to affordable food for all, health and obesity crisis, and that's not to say nothing of the sort of cultural and the social side of things. So if you deal with these things separately, not only is it not as effective, it can actually be counterproductive, and you make things worse elsewhere in the food system. So having this cross-sector partnership is about, so my role is about convening and bringing the right people to talk to each other. It's a contributory role. So, for example, I sit on the Lincoln Climate Commission and the Healthy Weight Partnership, and so cross-pollinate between these sort of different groups attending to food. And then it's sort of awareness raising and movement building. That's sort of what I do. So it's a bit of I'll tell you my journey of getting here, which is not what I expected. And the first thing I want to say is I'm taking an approach in relation to local planning. And I really want to assert that I don't see local planning as any kind of the solution. It's like quite a small piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and other things have to be tied in and are arguably even more important. But I came to this because Sustain approached us. Because Lincolnshire is like the filthiest county. And they came and said, would you like to organise a campaign around industrial livestock? And my response was, no, campaigning is not really my bag, and we're doing like so much already, that would be a distraction. And I told this to our advisory board, and they said, no, we're going to do it. So I said, fine, we'll get somebody else. I'd like a colleague anyway, that would be nice, we'll have somebody else. And they said, fine, just go and read the local plan and justify who you're gonna recruit. And I read the local plan, and then I was like, this is how it fits in Lincolnshire. But so you probably know about how planning works. There's the kind of the national planning policy framework, and then on top of that, local authorities have to do their own local plan. Lincolnshire, and I probably can count on one hand the number of people here from Lincolnshire. If you're from Lincolnshire, come and see me after, because I'd love to know if there's anybody else. There are not very many. It's a big agricultural county. And anyway, and it's very conservative. But the local authorities, for my local plan, I live in the city of Lincoln, and the Lincoln City Council is Labour. And then they share a local plan with West Lindsey, which is rural, and they have just become a Lib Dem council with all the Lib Dems' commitment to water quality. And the third partner in it is called Northcote Stephen. They're conservative. And the people that I know working for that authority they've just got a real can-do attitude. They're really sort of positive and constructive. And I just found it quite interesting that these three political groups have different things to bring and are working together, and they've created this local plan. The local plan is really good I don't want to be so surprised. It's a really good local plan. And I say that because they've got climate and nature aspirations front and centre of it. And they've done this despite opposition, especially from the county council, which is a statutory consultee, but they're only consultees. And so this local plan has gone against what the county council has sort of complained about and criticised. But it's all about energy and building and urban planning, and it doesn't really see food and farming at all. So I take for granted that in this room, you know, people are very aware of the climate implications and the pollution and the river water quality and the land implications of factory farming. But this is not visible in the local plan. So I had a good conversation. Am I all right? Okay. The lead planner, I went and had a good conversation with him, and I take my hat off to him for having got this local plan through. And I should have brought my slides, but just and this is what's happening in this, you know, the Environment Agency published all the reasons why the rivers are failing their good status. And it's so visible in Lincolnshire that catchment after catchment after catchment is agricultural pollution. So it's very easy to sort of demonstrate what the problem is, along with having the nation's biggest number of factory farm animals in Lincolnshire. And so he's like, oh yeah, I see your point. But even though I've pushed it, this is what he's saying, even though I've pushed through all of these measures, I don't think I can push that through, my suggestions about, limiting the proliferation of industrial livestock. And he's saying because you have to have the support from all the councillors. And Lincolnshire, it's really, being an important agricultural county, the whole sort of narrative in Lincolnshire is about being the UK's breadbasket. That's very, very important to the county's economy and to local identity, right? So he's like, right, okay, go and talk to your councillors and explain this to them, because you've got to have this support if you want to have any sort of changes. So I did all the consultation responses to the design codes, and he's like, so that's this is kind of my journey. I'm at an early stage on this journey. But interestingly, I just don't see that it's on people's radars. The extent to which I've talked to people about it so far, they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And including the Wildlife Trust who do routine responses to planning applications. But it's all about the building, you know, and they'll let through the new applications for industrial livestock units on the basis that it's not located in a special scientific area. So, yeah. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. I could listen to you all day, but don't stop on my account. But yeah, maybe in the interest of people getting to a drink later. All right. Okay, so I'm going to move to questions from me now, and then we'll be able to move to questions from the floor. So if you've got any, just keep them in mind for now. We'll be coming to the audience later. So my first question is, what would a just outcome look like for you? Where do you see justice informing the kind of changes that you want to see to the food and farming system? Do I have any volunteers to go first, or shall we come to you, Lídia?
Yeah, I think you asked me to start by laying out the concepts a little bit, right? If I well remember. Yeah, so just to say that, so in the context of our Roots of Change project, we're very much drawing on some of the just transition literature and its elaborations around the concept of justice. So just transition, by just transition we mean a fair and equitable process of moving towards a post-carbon society. That's, I guess, the simplest definition. But then having four dimensions of justice in mind. And these four dimensions are a recognition of acknowledging the perspectives of those who might be affected by policies and by transitions and might be disadvantaged in the process. So recognition of those actors. Representation, having those actors and those who might be disadvantaged and marginalized involved in decision making. Third, distribution, considering who are the winners and losers of policies and practices of transition, and then bearing that, taking that into account and ensuring equitable processes that are redistributive. And fourth, restoration. And restoration is very much about repairing harm done by previous harming policies and practices, both to society, both to people, and to ecologies. So this is the sort of the concept of justice, the multidimensional concept of justice that we want to work on. And then we're adding another dimension to that, which I think is very aligned with how agroecology, which is kind of the central concept, I guess, bringing many of us together in this conference, which is the idea of social ecological justice. And this is not social justice plus ecological justice, separate, but it's about looking at the interdependencies between people and nature. And I think that we have a lot to learn from indigenous thought on that. You know, you go to Brazil and talk to people in indigenous communities, and people want to make this distinction between us, human, and nature. They are the river, they are the water, we have nature inside our stomach, so we are people in nature, and nature is shaped by our presence. So this interdependence and co-constitution of people and nature have to be taken into account. And from a justice perspective, this makes us look at issues in a slightly different way. We can't think about social justice without ecological justice, and vice versa. Social ecological justice means that if only a small number of individuals and farmers in privileged positions are benefiting from an ecologically healthy landscape, this is not social ecological justice. We don't have social ecological justice if organic products are only affordable by the elites. I think there are several sessions on that in this conference, so I'm looking forward to those. We can't have social ecological justice if people are forced, for lack of options, into ecologically damaging livelihoods, including those factory farms, if there is no alternative. So we can't have social ecological justice if people don't have options. We can't have social ecological justice if nature conservation compromises farming livelihoods of small farmers and food security agendas. So this is not a form of nature recovery that is desirable from that interdependent social ecological perspective. So rewilding interventions that overlook social impacts, land conflicts, and negative implications for food security cannot be considered socially ecologically just. So in the context of our Roots of Change project, we are interested in looking at experiences of nature recovery and regenerative agroecological farmer that are aligned with this integrated social ecologic justice perspective, and I'm sure there's many, and we're looking forward to learn about those and have your inputs onto your direct experiences with embracing this more holistic, integrated vision of what justice means for people in nature. I'll leave it there.
Amazing, thank you. Jake, thanks.
Yeah, I'm going to start kind of with the injustice currently and move from there to some more abstract, and I hope in line with what Lydia is saying, ideas about what that means for what justice means, but I hope I don't lose that those things are completely connected. I hope that there's a connection between them and they have to be formed together. Yeah, so for most of what I think we're all saying today, we're pretty happy with the fact that most of you lot are happy with the fact that factory farming is pretty horrible. But the labor conditions of those who work in the industry, in processing and in feed mills, aren't talked about as often as other issues in some spaces. So I'll give a quick overview of the labor conditions in the poultry sector to start with. So again, numbers are a bit unclear, depending on who you include. There are somewhere between 30 and 100,000 workers in the chicken industry. According to the British Poultry Council, around 2/3 of these are migrant workers, most of whom are settled migrants from the EU, from Central and Eastern Europe. That may have reduced post-Brexit. There's a small number of seasonal migrant workers, though not more than a couple thousand. And from the research that has been done, some by a Guardian investigation in 2014 and some by Catherine Bernard and Fiona Costello, it's clear that the working conditions in the industry are really dire. Slaughterhouses run 24/7, often using shift lengths of over 12 hours and at line speeds approaching 200 birds per minute. This rate of work is maintained by the fact that the speed is controlled by the conveyor belt, and it's often coupled with extremely abusive behavior by management staff. This makes for extremely physically and mentally punishing work. Injuries are extremely common, probably much higher than those reported to Health and Safety England because of management abuse, but those rates are already some of the highest rates of any industry in the UK. There's also numerous chronic issues that come from spending long times on the line. Workers report bladder issues from being refused toilet breaks consistently, the cessation of periods, and chronic joint pain. Some even report having recurring nightmares about working on the line and the abuse they receive in the factory. Of course, this is all done on extremely low pay and precarious contracts, and many workers end up relying on food banks. So it's obvious that these conditions are far from just. And this is bigger than just the lives of these workers, as much as their lives make it a justice imperative on its own. Because these horrendous labor conditions are intertwined with issues that conferences like these address. So poor animal welfare, environmental destruction, pandemic disease, and so on. So if workers on farm and in the slaughterhouse have to do their work under extreme time pressure and under horrible conditions, the welfare of the chickens being taken out of the sheds and slaughtered suffers too. If workers don't have time to clean knives in between cuts because the line speed moves too fast, or if they can't solve machinery problems because the line can't be turned off because of contracting issues, then food hygiene suffers. If workers don't have sick pay, then, which a lot of workers don't, then they come into work with COVID and flu, producing conditions which are rife for producing flu pandemics. The H5N1 avian influenza virus is only, I think I've seen one mutation away from human to human transmission. And as during COVID, which a colleague of mine Bernice Hussaini and her colleagues have done a paper on the conditions of workers during that period. It will be racialized meat production workers that are exposed to that disease first and remain vulnerable to it throughout any pandemic conditions. And then in terms of ecological destruction, the immense pollution of the River Wye, for instance, is predicated upon the capacity to slaughter millions of chickens in a week in a single plant, which is itself built upon the intense exploitation of the workers who work in those plants. So the efforts that capitalists have made to extract more and more value from labor over the past decades are completely entangled with the increased extraction of value from chickens and the environment. So a key part of the movement for a just transition must therefore be the organized efforts of these workers to attenuate their exploitation. Slower line speeds in poultry processing plants could pave the way for a reduction of the number of chickens farmed in the UK. This would, of course, need to include farmers to avoid this resulting in simply a smaller number of just as intense factory farming units. And whilst there are significant difficulties in the kind of class relations in forming such a movement between farmers and precarious workers, the material conditions theoretically for that solidarity are there, in that contracted farmers, who make up 80% of the industry, have to answer to the same capitalists that these workers do, which is probably, for most of them, 3 bosses of 3 companies. So the theoretical conditions are there. In the event that such an alliance could be brought about, a degrowth, if you will, of chicken processing could pave the way for a de-intensification of factory farm units, meaning less precarious livelihoods for all involved, longer, healthier, and more fulfilling lives for broiler chickens, and a slowdown on the environmental destruction. And I must say at this point that in terms of justice, I don't think that's enough. That's reforms. But for me, justice means an end to exploitation and domination, and that means that no one, human or non-human, should give their life and death to produce profit for capitalists. Food producers should be working to meet social needs, and that means taking democratic control of the means of food production. This would allow us to democratically debate issues of food production, such as balancing nature and food security, such as whether or not it's moral to kill animals for food, right? Where currently, whilst we do have some policy, most of those decisions are left to capitalists and to the market. And so what I'm describing is a form of eco-socialism as a revolutionary horizon, but I think it's also agroecology, and I think it's also food sovereignty, which is, the values that this conference is all about. The Nyaleni Declaration says food sovereignty puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And for me, that's a description of decommodified food production. And that's the revolutionary horizon that needs to remain in sight whilst we do this smaller, that might feel unachievable at the present, but that's what needs to remain in sight whilst we do the base level organizing to just, for many migrant workers, that will mean just having a right to the same pay as their citizen counterparts. Maybe having citizenship as a basic thing if you're producing food for everyone in the UK, right? So those are the small things, but it's in pursuit of a much bigger goal. So yeah, and I hope that aligns with the fusing of social and ecological justice that Lydia's outlined. So yeah.
Thank you. It's very hard to hear.
Oh, sorry.
It's very hard. No, not audibly. I mean, just, I think emotionally. Thank you so much for that. Laura?
It's very difficult to listen to.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is about keeping the big picture in mind, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted here, and I feel like it's the right place to quote Colin Tudge, isn't it? Good food for everyone forever is the big social justice vision. So referring, I guess I'm just sort of reiterating a little bit of what you said about the inclusiveness to everybody to be able to afford food, and fairness to farmers, and long-term sustainability, and thought about future generations, and also about health. And I don't want to put health as a trade-off from pleasure, but say something about for everybody to enjoy nourishing food that nourishes us and is a pleasure for us. But to be much more specific, what are the risks of obliterating, if that were possible, cheap chicken and cheap pork? And the risk that people are concerned about is that, and this has happened in Europe, that it's replaced by cheaper imports where the standard is even lower, right? And that would defeat the object. And this is kind of where I come back to my original point that nothing we do, planning or anything else, it has to be like connected up with dietary change. And I just kind of want to assert like the role of cooks and chefs and bakers and caterers. And you know, people say like, I'm just a chef, and it's like, you're the interface between farmers and food production and what ends up on tables and on plates and on school dinner tables and on, you know, everywhere else. And so the valuing those people. And the other thing is that, you know, if chicken or pork becomes more expensive and becomes a luxury food, I don't actually have a problem with that. I think that's fine. The problem is that it doesn't become a luxury food for everybody. It becomes unattainable for the poorest people and a normal food for the rich people, and that's not fair, right? And so that's not a food problem, that's a deep inequality problem. It's still our problem, right? Because we're still human beings in a society, so we're still answerable to that. But it's not a food problem. It's a poverty problem. And I think my answer is not an adequate answer, but my response to that, that we as foodies, whatever role you're in, is avoiding talking about it and thinking about it, in elitist terms. So there is a tendency, and my local very good pork producer, it's like we make the best pork and it's a premium product and this kind of thing. It's like, let's not talk about it in that way. Let's talk about it as good food that should be available more widely, and the delicious, fresh, more plant-rich foods are a pleasure and should be available for everybody more widely, rich or poor, or you know, across society.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so my next question is, we've heard Steve read today as the figurehead of the government's agenda towards increasing food production and going hard out for food security. And yet, at the same time, Labour's got targets around nature recovery. What do you see as the key challenges of reconciling those two, what can feel like opposing aims, food security and nature recovery? And how can we reconcile those through a just transition? Anybody want to take that one? If you don't have to. If you don't want to take it, it's totally fine. We can move on. The audience will have questions. You don't have to take my questions.
All the same order then.
Yep.
Yeah. No, I had some notes here, but I'm just wondering whether I want to go through them. I think one of the problems is that we are, I think, in our minds, we see these as competing goals, right? And there's a narrative that supports that idea, that it's either recovering, protecting nature, feeding people, or supporting farming livelihoods. And perhaps the origins of that way of thinking is the way in which policy is normally quite a siloed space, because you have different departments looking at different issues. And that's certainly an issue. I think that's sort of a mentality that we need to fight. I think agroecology has been in this field for a long time, trying to showing those connections between protecting nature, promoting biodiversity, but locating people in that biodiversity. In Brazil, there's, I don't know if it's a Brazilian concept, but there's an interesting concept that I hear a lot about, which is agrobiodiversity. Someone this morning was talking about human biodiversity in the context of neurodivergence, I think. But it's this idea that we have to look at diversity also in nature, but in connection to humans, right? So this idea of agro-biodiversity captures that. I think recognizes that we have a place in nature. It's very hard to talk, to imagine a sort of a pristine world of nature going back to a stage where humans don't have a role. We have to recognize that we are in this earth. So it's looking at trying to see precisely those interdependencies and how to promote experiences that address the various goals. I wanted to just mention briefly the notion of agricultural wilding, which is something that we want to engage with. And there's, of course, all these debates around different terms and what they mean, and people become quite territorial. There was an interesting discussion around agroecology, regenerative farming, and so on this morning as well. But agricultural wilding is precisely, trying to, recognizing the value and the significance of rewilding and putting nature recovery front and center, as I think it's inevitable. We have to do something to change the world in which we live, but doing so alongside our concerns for social inclusion and justice and food security, food sovereignty. Food sovereignty not in a nationalistic term, because I think there's a danger sometimes when we talk about food sovereignty, certainly back in my country, and I think in Brazil as well, it's what's produced in this country is what you should be eating. Okay, there's a lot of value to local value chains and growing locally. But sometimes these agendas get a sort of a nationalistic connotation that I find quite dangerous. But back to the agricultural wilding, it's putting the emphasis then on rewilding practices that have also a food production goal in mind. So it's about promoting wild productive systems, which may be about pigs grazing freely in nature, other animals, extensive grazing systems, as well as wild crops and their potential to address food security concerns. I think there's a lot of it's a long way to, rethink, reimagine, reposition wild crops in European diets. I think a lot has been lost. Certainly in my country, we used to, chestnuts used to be our staple food. Chestnuts are now something that you eat occasionally, right? And potatoes have completely dominated our diets. I'm sure you have similar experiences here in the UK. So there's a long way to go to find the way, reintroduce some of these wild crops that can do a lot to nature and a lot of our bodies, to our bodies as well. We've lost the culture associated with these wild crops, so there's a lot to do. But certainly in terms of in the meat front, we were having this chat earlier, I think the reintroduction of wild pigs, for example, offers quite promising, potentially promising pathways. So our project is about identifying these various experiences that connect these different goals, and I just wanted to invite you all, if you have a moment before you leave this room, to contribute to our board. There's there on the wall on the right-hand side there. There are two axes, and we are so one a vertical axis has at the top strong food security concern, strong food security focus, and down at the bottom, very low or non-food security focus, and then a horizontal axis, which is about human intervention. So a more purist rewilding approach would have zero human intervention, would let nature recover, nature take over. So that's on the left-hand side of that axis. And then to the right, strong human intervention. So we would like to identify experiences that are located in different spaces in that diagram. So if you have suggestions from your own practices, please write them on a post-it note and stick it up there if you can before you leave the room. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. International question? Next question?
No, let me have that one, yeah. I think I start by agreeing is the big barrier is seeing them as trade-offs, and the polarization of the media and of social media is worsening that. And it just made me thought that, because obviously food security requires nature recovery, but I wonder, and it's a kind of curious thought, where maybe ORFC is very well placed actually in holding constructive and kind dialogues, because of course food security is an important objective and nature recovery is an important objective. Obviously the real work is doing both, and so yeah, have we got a part to play in that depolarization and that support of constructive conversation? I thought about this question, and so I'll credit the people that I'm quoting because I don't have original ideas. Jennifer Clapp says, the lock into the industrialized system is a big barrier to a just transition. Because everything is comes together, doesn't it? The commodified production, the global distribution, the ultra-processed diets, and so corporate power shapes policy and innovation and markets, and so everything has to be kind of addressed together because you can't just deal with one bit of it in the system. And then my third thought, and I'm quoting here Mike Duxbury, I don't know if he's here, who says the biggest barrier to a just transition is separation between farmers and consumers. I don't like using the word consumer. I'm going back to what I said about the importance of chefs and foodies in that interface between plates and tables and the land. But because it's not on people's agenda, so as part of food partnership work, I have conversations with people working on fair trade or something like that. And, you know, those guys will still be going to Tesco and getting their 15p carrots or whatever. And so I have to say, for me, it was being invited to John Turner's farm, who is a Lincolnshire farmer, which was organised by Kimberly Bell. These are both people who show up and talk at ORFC, and you should totally go and listen to them because they're absolute heroes of mine. Inviting me to the farm to make those connections was really, really powerful. And so farmers here, please do that. Please invite your food community to your farm, because I don't know that there's another way of closing that separation that I think is at the root of this disconnect that produces this system of farming that is so destructive.
Thank you. Anything to add, Jake? Very good. Great, thanks.
Yeah, just really quickly, on the food security thing, I just want to reiterate the point I made in the introduction, which is that, poultry production is not an exercise in food security as much as the industry want to paint it as that. So the British Poultry Council they coordinate the all-party parliamentary group on food security, because in their rhetoric, as Laura mentioned, they're trying to suggest that the production of less chicken would somehow be unjust because it would make chicken a luxury product, and that's obviously based on, firstly, just the fallacy of the idea that food should be distributed by the market. You know, there's only a problem if you distribute food according to people's purchasing power instead of what they actually need. But also, from what I described in the last answer, the production of food that is that cheap, the production of chicken that is that cheap, is built upon, is completely dependent upon the food insecurity of the people who produce it. So the production of cheap food doesn't produce food security. And what's the point of producing for food security if the people actually produce those food, which in the case of the chicken industry is 100,000 workers, but across the whole food industry, that's the case. There's 4 million workers in the food industry in the UK, and the Food Foundation's research has shown that they experience food insecurity at a higher rate than the average population. So the production of cheap food is systematically dependent upon the food insecurity of the people who produce it. So it's not a food security, it's not an exercise in food security. And the longer we engage with that debate on those terms, the more just ground we give the corporations who control these systems. So that's just very quick.
Thank you so much. Okay. I wanted to ask a question about the international perspective now. What international factors do you think we need to think about to make sure that the transition is just? Any volunteers to go first? Yes, go on, back to you, Jake, thanks.
Yeah, so there are loads of contingencies that I could talk about here in terms of like reducing chicken production, in terms of the question of whether or not it just gets imported from somewhere else with lower standards, or the question is just capital moving their production overseas, and also crucially the role of UK exports of chicken in intensifying global markets in developing countries. That's also, I think a lot of that debate tends to idolize British farming as something really good, and it's not. And actually, the export of British chicken contributes to the intensification of overseas markets through price shocks. But I think the most important issue that needs discussing in terms of the poultry industry is the industry's reliance on imports of soy feed. So the UK imports over 3 million tons of soy each year. Half of that is used by the poultry industry, because 60% of the 90% that is used for animal feed is used by the poultry industry. And the emissions from the production of this soy make up 70% of the emissions of the poultry industry. So this is like the bulk of the carbon impact, as much as there are lots of other impacts, but the carbon impact of the poultry industry. And really, really, really good recent research by the NGO Mighty Earth has shown that Cargill, who import most of this feed, around 60% of this feed, do supply soy to Moy Park, who are one of the bigger chicken producers in the UK, that comes from deforested land in the Amazon. So that's been established. And so the industry is completely dependent upon the extraction of value from deforested land in the global south. And the majority of the profits are collected by monopoly capitals in the global north. And it's this imperialist extraction that also creates the conditions in which migrant workers have to migrate to economies like the UK in order to find work, because their economies are being drained. And then they provide cheap labor for the factories in the global north. So this is, as much as it's great that we talk about kind of legacies of colonialism stuff, this isn't a legacy. This is like active imperialism. It's active extraction of value from south to north. And yeah, it would be like an omission at this point not to make the comparison to the situation in Gaza and in Palestine, because all of the social processes through which this system has been constructed, so the settler colonization of Australasia and the Americas for the production of cheap wheat, the genocide of the indigenous populations there, the violent extraction of wheat from colonized populations like those in India to fund the British war effort in World War II, and the replacement of industrial farming methods with traditional farming methods in countries of the global south, in South America in particular with regards to soy production, and then the use of dispossessed subjects as cheap labor. All of those social processes are what underpin the settler colonization of Palestine. It's the same imperialism, and in many cases it's the same capitals. It's the same capitalists in the UK and in America and in Palestine. So yeah, understanding the factory farm as like this big monopolized system of production instead of just these like individual farm sites means that we have to see a just transition, not just as like a better policy for river pollution in Wales or whatever. It has to be like a project of total liberation, and that includes an internationalist outlook. And so a huge aspect of that is like trade justice, which is a big aspect of the trade union movement in the UK, so making sure that trade standards are higher. But I think the key intervention is just the reduction of chicken production in the UK. It's based on imperialist extraction, and we need to reduce the amount of soy feed we use because that is imperialism materially, and there isn't an alternative. The industry is not happy with any of the alternatives because they're not cheap and they're not available on a massive scale. And anything that did suit those factors would probably not be any better than soy feed. So yeah, reducing the amount of chicken production and consumption is not just a question of justice in the UK. It's an international question. And yeah, as much as there's loads of nuances and details about imports, the reduction is the key thing. Like, it's end of story. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Lydia.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, thanks.
Jake has been very eloquent on these issues, but I just wanted to connect to what you were saying. I think the international perspective shows you how injustices are connected globally, and it's important to have that in mind. So you're talking about cheap chicken feed that is imported from the global south. A lot of that comes from Brazil, and a lot of that produces a lot of injustices in relation to nature, biodiversity, in relation to people, land grabbing, all sorts of forms of violence, physical violence against people that happens in the areas where soybean is being intensively produced in the center of the country. So seeing the connections between these injustices, Brazil exports cheap soybeans as well as frozen chicken to the UK, that you can find in fast food outlets in this country. And the injustices and all the issues, all the problems that it creates in this country are linked to injustices elsewhere. So I want to then connect that to the rewilding movement in the UK, and discussions around environmental targets and net zero targets, and just make the point that these tend to be, again, very nationalistic, centric agendas. It's about countries then showing off internationally how well they're doing, right? We see governments, talking about the goals, they need to show progress. But I think we need a different perspective on that. We can't compromise nature elsewhere, protect nature in this country. So rewilding here can't be at the cost of, okay, let's recover nature in this country, but then food will be imported from elsewhere. So I think farmers' concerns about the implications for food imports are very important, have to be taken seriously, and the implications of actions in one country, the implications in other countries need to be taken into account, and therefore, an international perspective on justice just allows us to make these connections. And I think I just wanted to end with, paraphrasing our LVC, La Via Campesina colleagues, when they say globalize the struggle, globalize the hope. I think that's the sort of mindset that we should all adopt.
Thank you. Laura, we are running short of time, and I want to let the audience have questions, so thanks.
Really briefly, to reiterate what you said, just to bring your attention, if you haven't or if you're not aware of it already, the Land Workers Alliance and Hodmer together produced this report called Soy No More, and it's really worth looking up. But LWA colleagues went to South America to engage with the Kayapa community there, who were right at the coalface of indigenous land rights, and so the other way, we're like, what can we do to stand in solidarity with you guys? And they said, stop feeding soya to your pigs and poultry and buy our Brazil nuts. So that's all I would add.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. You thought that you were just here to listen, but you're actually here to get involved. So we're over to questions from the audience. So, oh my goodness. Okay. Well, shall we start from... So we've got one here. Let's start from the back and then we'll move forward. So puffer jacket at the back. Do you want to go first? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my question is much more focused on the kind of social justice for all. And thinking a little bit about the farmers in this as well, because I think it's really important that we focus so far on farm workers. But I imagine that when you're looking at a just transition, leaving behind certain groups of people in that wouldn't make it just. So kind of to Laura's final point, which was around buy our Brazil nuts, for areas like industrial poultry, what is their equivalent of Brazil nuts?
So in terms of UK farm, what can we do to support UK farmers to do the equivalent of Brazil nuts?
Yeah, well, not necessarily. What's a just transition plan? So what is moving away from an industrial system? What would that look like then? Because just
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. And there has to be another side. I mean, the DEFRA figures this year is like specialist pig and poultry is profitable, whereas on average, horticulture is loss-making, and that's the wrong way round. So, I mean, the solutions are multiple, and I won't dive into like all of them, but the obvious one that I say to people on a local level is buy a veg box, support your veg producers. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking about?
Sorry, so I was talking about our own context, which is I'm a conservation grazer. We sell our meat directly to our customers wherever we can. We're also setting up a micro dairy. So we're looking to be able to bring nutrition directly to people in the local community. And I've worked with a lot of different farmers over the years, and particularly thinking about those who are locked in more of a kind of this type of system that we've been talking about. What does justice look like for them? Like, not all of them will be able to go to veg box systems. Not all of them will have land which suits that. So is there kind of potentially more of a focus on the regenerative transition here and actually bringing some of these systems to life that we would be comfortable with? So potentially pastured poultry, or I suppose it would be then real investment from government, so policy change, investment in those types of systems that would fit with all of the different kind of indicators that we need to be able to work towards. So not only net zero, but also bringing back habitat and really focusing on biodiversity, water, air quality, all of these different things.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody?
That's precisely the types of experiences that we're trying to map. I think there's a lot of, there's a question of how you support that, right? And there isn't enough in the policies, enough details around, just around that and the sort of practices that should be supported and what support should look like. But there's lots of very interesting experiences, like the one you described, where there's a closer connection between experiences like your own and then people who can, you didn't want to talk about consumers, right? But people who might be interested in supporting those experiences, having access to that sort of food, but also being able to support the services that you deliver to society and nature, right? Because there's services there that you are delivering to our society and to nature that are not usually taken into account. When we talk about cheap food, it's not really cheap food, right? It's food that is being priced low because a lot of the costs are being subsidized and a lot of the costs are not being factored in at all. All the environmental and social costs, including, the terrible conditions that people live in, and then that will have consequences for people's health, well-being, and just stability of society as a whole. So none of this is being costed. So that, that's why the chicken seems cheap, but it's not cheap. There's all these costs that are being generated. So, the sort of farming systems that produce food that is more, has higher price, it's just because it's being priced more justly to, and perhaps not even entirely, because there's a lot of ecological benefits of producing in an ecologically sound way that are not being factored in, right? So, yeah, thanks for sharing that experience. And yeah, please, I invite you to add to our board if you can, if you have time.
Yeah, it's exactly what we want to hear, basically. We have a question on the iPad, so should we move to you, Lily?
Is that on, yeah? Maybe one for Jake. Do you see a way of finding an alignment between the factory farm and processing labour organisations / unions and the environmentalists and animal welfare advocates? Any examples, brackets, health outcomes, ?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's part of what motivated me to study this, because I think it's possible. Like, and I think a really good example is the climate movement in particular. So particularly over the past 5 years, the climate movement has dealt really effectively with questions of capitalist social relations and class, I would say much more effectively than the food movement has. And so now it's a very common thing in the climate space for trade unions in sectors like transportation and automotive production to be working in alliance with environmental activists to move to different forms of production. And there's really good examples of that across Europe, like the GKN occupation in Italy. So I think it's possible, like theoretically. I think currently, part of the reason that I wanted to do this project is I think currently some animal welfare activism does denigrate workers. It does kind of point at workers in the industry as people who abuse animals, rather than seeing the abuse of animals and the abuse of the workers as the same thing, right? And so, I think theoretically the exploitation is linked, and the solidarity needs to be linked too. And I hope they can do it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, question from the floor. You've actually had your hand up first right at the beginning, so let's take your question, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's been fascinating, but a lot of what you said strikes me as being very theoretical and very complicated. And if the aim of this session, which I thought it was to challenge the various iniquities of intensive factory farming, I think it's much simpler, and so shoot me down. But if we were to apply polluter pays properly, if we were go for best practice animal welfare rather than good practice animal welfare, if we had an effective grocery code adjudicator to balance power between supermarkets and producers, if we were to properly incentivise extensive systems through ELM and the like, rather than at the expense of intensive systems, then that would deal with pretty much all of the actual problems that you've identified, wouldn't it? I don't see what we gain by adopting this much more theoretical approach to deal with the problem. And I don't think any of those half dozen points I said are particularly contentious. I don't think most people in the street would think, that's a bit too left field for me.
Yeah, both and. I don't see there's a conflict at all. But you said, it's really simple, and then listed at least 5 things, and I would add to that, on top of that, you've got to limit the proliferation of these units, because otherwise it just goes to an export market. And so we could probably think of a few more.
I guess I would also have added, sorry, I'm afraid I'm shouting over the microphone, trade policy that takes account of means of production, not just outcomes. But again, not that contentious, I would have thought.
Yes.
I'll respond to that, because I'm a massive theory head, so apologies. But I would argue that whilst a lot of what I was saying was theoretical, it's drawn from an analysis of just the condition of the workers. It's not based in theory, and it's not abstract. It's based in the lived experience of these people who produce in the industry, right? And I think all of the policy suggestions you're saying, they can't happen without the rights of these workers also being respected. And the point I'm trying to make, and the reason that the kind of theoretical approach is important, is that I would argue that those policies the only people who can push for policies like that are the workers themselves. They have the interest to push for better policy on line speeds. So in the Reagan era...
I've spent the last 30 years pushing for them, and I've never been in a poultry factory. I don't get that at all.
But I think the point I would make is that workers have the material power to do so, right? We spend a lot of time in the UK food movement lobbying through NGOs and through charities who ultimately don't control any of food production, whereas workers in factories, they do that work, and they can stop doing that work. It's a strike, right? And it's been a key tactic that has got through many policies over the 20th century, right? And that's actual power that can be used to push policies through, and that can be used to negotiate for policies where, yeah, people like us, as an academic, I can make recommendations, but I don't have any material power over the food system. So that's I think.
Well, I think let's move on to another question. But as a chair, I've got the privilege to be able to say that I think the theoretical foundations that we've heard on the panel today is exactly what we need to go away with as policymakers and think carefully when we're making recommendations and we're advocating for policy, that everything we've heard goes into everything that we're calling for the grocery code adjudicated transition, and everything in the list that you reeled off and many more. We need to be thinking about a just transition throughout all of it. And at the moment, that's not what it looks like. More questions. Okay. You did have your hand up right early on, so let's come to you. Thanks. In the sort of puffer Gillet. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention another injustice that it seems hasn't been mentioned today, which is the mass consumer who doesn't really have a choice in what they eat in a lot of situations. I mean, if you go outside of Zone 1 in London, literally the only thing on the street for people to eat, other than to go into supermarkets and make things from scratch, which would be fabulous, is kebab shops and Greggs. And they don't even have a clue what's going on here. It's not part of the education system. They're not aware of these other injustices and the fact that probably where many people's relatives live, that these, this imperialism is taking place. They don't have a clue about it. So, and they're a much larger audience than, the workers at these factories.
Could I push you for a question? We're really short of time. Is there a question as part of the statement?
There's a question of how do we reach them with Jake's research, which would be fabulous. How do we reach them to, because they have a say in it as well. I totally agree. The workers should strike tomorrow. But the the consumers need to know that by having their kebab, they're contributing to this. Because a lot of them would say, oh, well, actually, I'm not going to buy it.
So the question, if I may paraphrase, is that how do we engage with the consumer rather than focusing our power on the people with the most power? Would anybody like to take this one?
Yeah, I want that one. Yeah, absolutely. There are people who don't have choices, and those are not the people that we should be targeting to make changes. That's completely unreasonable and unfair. And again, I'm going to make the point that there are like so many interventions and there isn't a silver bullet. But I'll just mention one of them. I was at the school dinners event that was hosted by Oxfordshire County Council last night. And one of the speakers did the most beautiful quote, which was something like, the litmus test of a government's commitment to social justice is school dinners. And we're currently spending like £2.50 per school dinner or something like that. So that would be a really, really easy way of getting better food on the menu, giving the nutritional justice to all the kids, and doing the procurement stuff that would support the kind of farming that we want to see.
Can I just, a little bit of promotion, the project where I volunteer on Wednesdays, which is a veg box scheme. Sorry, I can't see you. Which is a veg box scheme that is partly subsidized. So this is specifically located in a deprived area. I think you were talking about those who can't afford to make these choices, right? So this is a project that is specifically located in the deprived area of Brighton, and it targets members of that community. So it's a veg box scheme where you pay according to your possibilities. I think across the UK there's many examples of these types of schemes. But there are different things that are going on here. So the main activity is the distribution of this fruit and vegetable box every fortnight, and you pay either you pay the full price if you can afford, you pay more than full price to be able to then support a family that, or a household or a person who can't afford to pay the full price of the box. So some families, some households pay as little as £5 for an 18 pound worth of fruit and vegetable, over 18 pound worth of fruit and vegetable. So this is the main activity. Alongside that, the project organizes a series of initiatives, including taking children to local farms, so having exposure to other types of foods, so that you also, share that experience and contribute to families' well-being. So there's interesting experiences going on across the UK, also elsewhere. I just wanted to mention briefly the Black Food Sovereignty Movement in Canada and their project, African, that precisely targets, people who are in very deprived conditions in marginalized areas of Toronto, and that tries to work with them to have access to land, to be able to grow foods that are culturally appropriate, but also to ensure that affordability of decent, healthy food. So there's many examples of that, and we should all be supporting those. Thank you.
Thank you. We have to wrap up there because it's just about time to close. But I wanted to close with two things to encourage you to do on your way out. The first one is our rewilding activity. So if you've got a position or a perspective on rewilding that you want to share, please go over there and talk to Lídia. We really want to get some ideas about where we start on our rewilding project. The second is, if you've got direct experience about intensive livestock farming, if you've been affected by it, if you are a farmer who lives near an intensive livestock unit, we are interested in talking to you about getting some more perspectives about what it's like to be on the receiving end of the impacts of these units. So please come and talk to Lily, who's at the front here, or me afterwards, because the more testimony we can get about the impacts of these units, the better. Finally, you might have seen muck maps at the back. We've got the two people who produced muck maps here at the front, along with Anthony from Compassion, who was also involved. So if you're interested in learning more about muck maps or having a look, please do talk to them or come over and have a look. I think that's it. I should also plug the drinks upstairs, which are happening in half an hour, which is for new entrants into food and farming. And before I close, of course, let's thank the panel. Thank you so much. Right. Thank you so much. You're free to go. Well, not...